I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey folks, Jesse Shade from Awfully Good Movies here. And while we may have had a lot of awfully great movies come out over the past year of 2018, we still had to endure a lot of pretty damn bad ones. For every Incredibles 2, there was also a Hotel Transylvania 3. For every Isle of Dogs, there was also a Show Dogs. For every great Halloween reboot, there was also a shitty Death Wish reboot. And for every Sherlock Gnomes, there was also a Sherlock Gnomes. And so we salute all these cinematic heaps of trash with this year's list of the top 10 worst movies of 2018, as voted by the readers of JoBlo.com. And while these top 10 movies were voted onto the list by our JoBlo readers, we've also fairly adjusted the sorting order a little bit by adding the film scores on Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb and dividing that sum by the percentage of readers who voted for that film. So my thanks go out to the 1,437 awesome JoBlo readers who voted for the poll this year. And an even bigger thanks to those 13 people who were brave enough to vote for Sherlock Gnomes. Boy, I hope they make one final chapter to finish off this Gnome trilogy by making The Hunchback of Notre Dame, co-starring the voices of Lupita Nyong'o and Al Pacino. Hooah! So without further ado, JoBlo.com and Awfully Good Movies present your picks for the top 10 worst movies of 2018. Number 10, Pacific Rim Uprising. 5 years ago, Guillermo del Toro gave us his biggest commercial movie to date with Pacific Rim, and while it may have suffered the indignity of being beaten by Grown Ups 2 at the box office that weekend, it certainly had enough of an appeal on the foreign market that Legendary Pictures decided to keep the Pacific Rim universe alive with another installment. However, Guillermo del Toro was a little busy at the time, winning himself an Oscar. So now it was up to former Daredevil showrunner Steven DeKnight to direct the kaiju chaos this time around, with the newly introduced John Boyega taking the place of his father Idris Elba to try and re-cancel the apocalypse. But while Del Toro's first movie added a lot of his signature visual style to help justify all the robot on alien brutality, the sequel just headed straight towards Michael Bay's Transformers territory instead, with a whole lot of ludicrous CGI building wreckage going on between big-ass robots and big-ass alien monsters that kept getting intercut with some terribly uninteresting human drama. In other words, it felt less like a Pacific Rim sequel and more like a Pacific Rim ripoff movie made by the Asylum.
I'm really confused, but I think Pacific Rim Uprising actually stole this part from Atlantic Rim.
And though this sequel still did financially well around the rest of the globe, it failed to make much of an impression with American audiences, leaving the fate of a third Pacific Rim movie currently up in the air. I mean, who would have thought we'd get to see a Pacific Rim sequel come out the same year as a Transformers spin-off movie, and the Transformers movie would end up getting the far better reviews? Clearly it's time for Charlie Day to fix up these giant robots of his for the third Pacific Rim by calling in his best buddy Frank Reynolds to pilot one of these Jaegers. Number 9, Venom. After agreeing to share joint custody of the Spider-Man franchise with Marvel Studios 3 years ago, the Sony Corporation has actually been pretty damn good to the wisecracking webslinger this past year, with a Spider-Man PS4 game that was one of the best games of the year, and an animated Spider-Man movie that was one of the best films of the year. But Sony still remained insistent on keeping the rights to other characters from the Spider-Verse so that they could establish their own Marvel Universe, which kicked off this year with a spin-off movie based off of Spider-Man's most popular foe. After all, the last time Sony Pictures tried forcing that character into a movie, we ended up with a frost-tipped Topher Grace wearing Shark Boy teeth. But this time the role of Eddie Brock was now played by Tom Hardy, who traded in his Bane mask here for a CGI black alien symbiote that forms onto Eddie Brock's body to turn him from hard-hitting journalist to bloodthirsty creature. And while Tom Hardy certainly did make an effort with his dual performance, the movie itself perfectly demonstrated why Sony should leave the Marvel Cinematic Universes to the actual Marvel Studios, as other variants of the Venom symbiote were forced into the incomprehensible plot, and the character of Venom was saddled with some lame-ass wisecracking dialogue that even Freddy Krueger wouldn't wipe his ass with.
You will be this honest, legless, faceless thing rolling down the street like a turd in the wind.
Seems to me you live your life
like a turd
in the wind.
Still, I should point out that this movie did have quite a few fans, so those who like the movie should be happy to know that Sony will be making more of their own Marvel adventures, whether Marvel Studios or the movie critics like it or not.
All we are is in the wind.
Number 8. The Predator. Speaking of infamously scary aliens who have faced off against Topher Grace, the Predator franchise has sure gone down a lot of strange and different directions ever since the release of the original Schwarzenegger classic, which happened to co-star in its cast a future legendary screenwriter by the name of Shane Black. So to return the favor to this franchise for launching his career, Shane decided to help write and direct the umpteenth reboot of the Predator franchise. But this time, the alien Predator's latest hunt on Earth involved him facing off against a ragtag group of military vets suffering from severe PTSD that have been locked up by the government. They're just like the A-Team, but if all the members of the A-Team had serious mental health issues. But before this latest Predator installment hit theaters, the studio ordered Shane Black to reshoot the film's third act due to poor test screenings from audiences, who did not gel with the film's overly comedic tone, rubbing up against all the bloody alien carnage. Although this reshot third act sure didn't help audiences understand why we now had autistic children and fucking predator dogs being introduced into this franchise. Did we learn nothing from the Ang Lee Hulk movie, people? So while the movie did open up at the top of the box office that weekend, audiences generally thought Shane Black's new take on the Predator franchise was one ugly motherfucker. And whether or not 20th Century Fox wants to give us another Predator reboot remains to be seen. After all, Shane Black isn't the only member of the Predator cast with some directing experience. Wink wink, Arnold, this may be your big chance to return to this franchise.
You son of a bitch!
Number 7. Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Yes, you folks may remember the controversy which ensued a few years back when the JoBlo.com readers had voted Jurassic World as the third worst movie of 2015, even though that flick had received a fairly solid reception from most critics and audiences at the time. But by the time they were preparing their next installment of the Jurassic franchise, the studio looked like they were serious about addressing some of the problems with the first Jurassic World. Now, Colin Trevorrow was replaced in the director's chair by acclaimed Spanish filmmaker J.A. Bayona, with none other than Jeff motherfucking Goldblum returning to the franchise as Ian Malcolm. However, even though the advertising made a big deal out of Goldblum's return, he ended up just having a small cameo in the final film, and left his shirt woefully buttoned the entire time. As most of the movie focused on the returning Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard, without her high-heel shoes or Prince Valium from Spaceballs haircut this time, coming back to the island of Isla Nublar to save the remaining dinosaurs from being killed by an erupting volcano. Even though we have now had 4 movies which should have taught these stupid people to leave these fucking dinosaurs extinct already. And with Colin Trevorrow still staying on as a screenwriter, the sequel went down an even dumber route than its predecessor, by bringing in James Cromwell as the former partner of John Hammond, who plans to genetically modify these dinosaurs and sell them on the black market. At this point, I would not be shocked if the next movie went into full-on Gremlins 2 territory. So while the sequel's big-ass box office haul will help start production on a third Jurassic World, it's pretty evident by now that Universal is so preoccupied with whether or not they could continue this franchise that they are not stopping to think whether or not they should. If only somebody could have warned us about that 25 years ago! Number 6. The Cloverfield Paradox. If there's one thing that holds the wildly different films of JJ Abrams' Cloverfield franchise together, it would be their cryptically confusing trailers, which get released out of nowhere, with the 10 Cloverfield Lane trailer getting released only 1 month before the film hit theaters. But that's nothing compared to the sudden release of the teaser for the third Cloverfield movie during this year's Super Bowl, which revealed that the film was skipping theaters entirely and being released on Netflix that very night. And when audiences went to open up Netflix right after the big game expecting to watch another awesome installment in the Cloverfield series, they instead got suckered into watching a cheaply made sci-fi thriller, which producer JJ Abrams just happened to slap the Cloverfield name onto, with a few minor alterations to tie it into the Cloverfield universe. And when the chairman of Paramount saw that this crappy movie would never make back its budget being released in theaters, he and Abrams decided to sell the movie off to Netflix. and their genius marketing move of having the film released on the same night as its first teaser trailer attracted up to 5 million viewers in the film's first week of streaming. But not many of those 5 million people were happy with the otherwise good Cloverfield movies being tied into this glorified Sci-Fi Channel original movie. So we shall see if Netflix will do any better with its next anthology-themed installment of the Cloverfield series, The Ballad of Cloverfield Scruggs.
Well, that ain't good.
Number 5. Robin Hood. According to the legends of English folklore, Robin Hood was seen in medieval England as a heroic outlaw who stole money from the wealthy upper class so he could give it to the poor and unfortunate folk of the lower classes. But after seeing his story retold in movie after movie after BBC TV show after movie, I'm now starting to think that Robin Hood is also stealing himself some money off of the movie going public. That was certainly the case with this latest modernized retelling of the Robin Hood legend, where the Merry Thief was now played by the breakout star of the Kingsman movies, Taron Egerton, with Jamie Foxx taking the role of Robin's loyal Chief Lieutenant Little John, and Ben Mendelsohn in his 378th villainous performance playing the Sheriff of Nottingham. But much like Guy Ritchie's failed retelling of the King Arthur story 1 year prior, this latest Robin Hood movie tried way too hard to modernize this classic folktale for the video game generation, with its frenetically photographed fight sequences and overuse of Zack Snyder-style slow-mo. And after this flick's lip theatrical box office haul, the only people who got their money stolen by this Robin Hood were the poor bastards at the studio who thought it could possibly be a big hit. Personally, I'd like to see them go in a really bold direction next time and give us a Black Robin Hood, in the proud tradition of Master Thespian Daffy Duck.
So trip it up and down.
Number 4, A Wrinkle in Time. After the Oscar-nominated success of her Martin Luther King biopic, Selma, director Ava DuVernay soon found herself getting an offer from Disney to direct the Black Panther movie. But DuVernay decided to ask Disney if she could instead direct the studio's planned cinematic adaptation of Madeleine L'Engle's beloved children's sci-fi book, A Wrinkle in Time, which DuVernay happened to love reading in her childhood. And in the roles of the 3 astral traveling witches, which help a plucky little girl search the cosmos to find her missing astrophysicist father, those parts were cast with a tremendous trio of diverse female talent consisting of Mindy Kaling, Reese Witherspoon, and the one and only Oprah Winfrey. However, the history of book-to-film adaptations has shown us that there are certain classic works of literature out there which are a bit too complex to translate coherently onto the big screen. And such was sadly the case for this incomprehensible cosmic fantasy that may have delighted some fans of the source material, but mostly confused the rest of us as to why Oprah Winfrey was now 50 feet tall and wearing Dragon Ball Z hair. Still, even though the film was a big disappointment for Disney, no amount of bad reviews could take away Ava DuVernay's honor of becoming the first African-American woman to direct a $100 million movie at the box office. Penny Marshall is truly proud of you, young Padawan. Number 3, Gotti. Over the course of his time as the head of the Gambino crime family, John Gotti proved himself to be one of the most fascinating criminal masterminds in cultural history. So you would think the man's life would prove perfect material for a top-notch mafia movie, with John Travolta fresh off his latest comeback in The People vs. O.J. Simpson, playing the role of the infamous Teflon Don. But instead of having Scorsese or Coppola in the director's chair, this Gotti biopic was being directed by one of those guys from the Entourage show. You know, the one who looked like an elf, what's his name? And after the movie had received a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes and failed to open in the top 10, the movie's producers even went to mafia-like tactics against the film's naysayers, as they tried rigging the movie's audience score from the Rotten Tomatoes community to come out to 80%, and used Twitter ads to dismiss the film's negative critics as merely trolls behind a keyboard. But aside from its strange marketing tactics, the actual movie was a far cry from the high standards for mafia sagas set by your Godfathers and Goodfellas, with the incomprehensible editing jumping back and forth in time through the events of John Gotti's life for no particular reason. And while Travolta's performance was certainly far from being as bad as Battlefield Earth, his cartoonish New York accent here made him feel less like John Gotti and more like an elderly Vinnie Barbarino. So after 8 years of production hell, the final result on this Gotti biopic proved to be pretty goddamn underwhelming. So I can only imagine that the rest of the Gotti family will soon show their displeasure with this Mr. Travolta by making him an offer he can't refuse. Number 2, The Happy Time Murders. In 2008, the Jim Henson Company announced it was branching into more adult-oriented work by starting production on The Happy Time Murders, which was conceived as a Roger Rabbit-esque detective comedy set in a world where puppets coexist alongside human beings, with a hardened puppet detective being teamed up alongside an equally cranky human detective to solve a series of mysterious murders involving puppet cast members from a beloved family sitcom. And after a decade of the film languishing in production hell, the film was finally brought to the big screen this year with the role of the human detective played by Melissa McCarthy. But while the film's original concept art had originally envisioned a dark film noir-esque atmosphere around all this dark comedy, the final product felt more like a 5-minute cop show parody for Funny or Die that got stretched painfully thin over 90 minutes. Besides, the concept of kid-friendly puppet entertainers revealing themselves to be nasty scumbags isn't all that shocking anymore, and this movie script didn't offer much more to the table other than the cheap novelty of horny Muppets ejaculating silly string out of their dicks. And while Melissa McCarthy did well at dialing back her physical shtick here, she and the rest of the live-action cast had their comedic talents wasted by taking a back seat to these filthy-minded puppets. But even though their 10 long years of hard work didn't end up paying off for their big passion project, the Henson Company is moving on from this disappointment to start work on some hopefully better non-Muppet projects. So don't expect the Henson Company to be adding sex and or violence into the Muppet universe anytime soon, since that cruel bastard Jim Henson decided to build these Muppet characters without any goddamn genitals.
Do you think you're a good lover?
You see, this is the complete Kermit that you're looking at.
It's beautiful.
And now we finally reach the number 1 film which was voted by the readers of JoBlo.com to be the worst movie of 2018, 50 Shades Freed. It's hard to believe it was 3 years ago when the best-selling sexual exploits between the sexy brooding billionaire Christian Grey and the meekly mannered college student Anastasia Steele were finally brought onto the big screen, with the first film making so much money at the box office that Universal decided to film the next 2 50 Shades movies back to back. In spite of the first film's utter ravaging from the critics. And while the second installment may not have opened up at the top of the box office, the third and final 50 Shades film ended up being the competition yet again on Valentine's Day weekend, although it did have the lowest box office opening in the franchise's history. Perhaps audiences had lost some of their initial enthusiasm in the 2 years they had to wait between movies, in between which was released a shitty 50 Shades parody movie. And now that this third film had Christian and Anna finally embracing domestic life and getting hitched together, the chemistry between these two now went from feeling dangerous and exciting to just plain creepy and gross, with all the ludicrous romantic dialogue and overwrought plot devices that you would expect from a film series based off a terrible book series that started out as fan fiction from another terrible book series. But while Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson will have no trouble moving on with better things in their careers, their work in the 50 Shades trilogy will never live down the infamy of having all 3 of its films, including its parody film, end up on our list for the worst movies of the year, with its final installment being declared the worst movie of 2018. As for any men and women who have been forced to sit through these terrible movies on a Valentine's Day date night with your romantic partner, they, much like the 50 Shades, have also been freed. Freed from having to sit through another shitty 50 Shades of Grey movie ever again!
I'm free! Free! Free at last! I'm absolved! Released! Exculpated! Free! I flew to coop!
And there you have them, folks, the top 10 movies that you voted as the very worst movies to come out in 2018. Maybe one day I'll review one of those films on Awfully Good Movies, which you can catch new episodes of on the JoBlo Videos YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm Jesse Shade for JoBlo.com, hoping you all have a very happy new year. And we leave you once again with a list of the bad movies which didn't quite make our list this year. Give me a beat, Mary J. Blige Gnome!
Join up with me, so joyous and free. Let's away to old Sherwood High. For I'm Robin Hood, and I'm very good at avoiding the sheriff's eye. So we'll trip along merrily, or the greensward so gracefully. To trip it, trip it, trip it, trip it, trip it up and down. To trip it, trip it, trip it, trip it, trip it, trip it.